start time. So it's with great pleasure that both Jules and I, representing PENS, would like to introduce to you Shane Pills, who is from the university, Pill is from the Flinders University in Melbourne, currently in a less sort of open environment than it probably has been in recent times. And Shane is going to present to us on the spectrum of teaching styles in physical education, with a view to giving us renewed information and I guess accentuating again the importance and the possibilities of the Mostyn spectrum of teaching styles. So we'll hand over to you, Shane, and we look forward to hearing from you throughout. If you are interested in asking specific questions, we'll monitor that chat, and if necessary, we'll address those questions with Shane at that time. Otherwise, there will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end. I'm hoping, Shane, you're able to hang around for a few minutes. And a reminder that everything presented throughout this conference will be available within about 24 hours on our PENS conference website for you to re-engage with or to go to places you haven't been able to view things up until now live. So handing over to you, Shane. Paul, thank you very much, and with a warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity that PENS have provided to have this chat today. Looking forward to talking about Mostyn spectrum of teaching styles and how it can power up the teaching of physical education. But once you understand Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles, you'll be able to apply it to any subject you teach, to sports coaching, because it provides a universal framework for best practice in learning design. And it's not just a model of practice, it's a philosophy of practice as well. So I speak to you today from Ghana land. I'm at Flinders University in South Australia. We're in the foothills, looking down onto the Adelaide Plains today. There's a big fog sitting there. It's rolling up the hill at the moment, so it might get a little bit darker in my office in a short space of time because I forgot to put the light on when I came in, because it was a lovely sunny winter's day when I started. I pay my respect to the Ghana elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing connection to the land that I speak from today. In this session today, I'm going to talk about models-based practice and why models-based practice has been advocated for physical education, and in particular for powering up student learning outcomes, and where Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles fits in the whole framework of models-based practice in physical education. But to start off with, I'd like to hear from the people who are attending today using the chat function. What models-based practice for physical education are people currently aware of? What models do you already know? What models do you already use? So just a minute or two using the chat bar now, if you could punch in the names of any models that you're familiar with or that you're currently using. I understand there's a 15-second delay, so while people are typing in what models they already know, models-based practice, if you Google it, you'll often come across Metzler's key textbook, Instructional Models of Physical Education. And he identifies a series of common models, but there are health-promoting physical education models that don't exist in Metzler's book. So many people are familiar with the work of Metzler in models-based practice, and some of you may have his book. If you don't have his book and you're interested in models-based practice, it's an excellent starting point for this idea because it gives the blueprint for the common, what I'll call second generation models in physical education. Okay, not surprisingly, we're seeing TGFU, game sense, sport education, teaching personal and social responsibility. Game sense and sport education come under what Metzler would call a tactical model. Constraints-led approach is in there. Some argue a constraints-led approach is not a model. Some argue that it is a model. Teacher-directed, yes, teacher-directed in every subject area is probably the basis of what we refer to as the traditional or common model of teaching, regardless of what subject you're in. Okay, so judging by those few responses, maybe there's not a lot known about models-based practice. So in table 1, which I provide today, which comes from a paper that I published a couple of years ago, where I looked at secondary physical education teachers in Australia and their familiarity with models-based practice. And I was able to identify from the literature 11 distinct models that have their own blueprint. A teacher can get that blueprint and follow the recipe and be adhering to a very distinct model of practice. Most people who have done contemporary physical education training last 10 or 15 years would have done sport education, TGFU, game sense, probably TPSR. We've got the health-based physical education movement as well. And the first of those health-based physical education movements was Pangrazi's dynamic physical education in the 1970s. So when we Google and read textbooks now about models-based practice, it's those models in that table that frequently come up. But what often gets missed in the literature are the first generation models. And the spectrum of teaching styles is a first generation model. It was developed in 1966. Quite remarkably, the wisdom from 1966 remains as current today as it was then. And that's one of the big things I think you'll take away from today's session, is how familiar the ideas developed in 1966 are to best practice teaching today as well. Another example of a first generation model is Malden and Redfern's teaching physical education, which before TGFU was in the literature, set out game categories, set out an inquiry teaching strategy, set out a game first teaching approach. All the elements that we would now describe as TGFU or game sense were evident in that first generation model, teaching physical education, published by Malden and Redfern in around about 1969. So there's a familiarity for those of us who are into their 50s, there's a familiarity with these newer second generation models and the first generation models that existed prior to them. I'm wondering whether people understand why models-based practice is advocated for physical education. So those people who were able to reply that they've had some familiarity with using models-based practice, could you use the chat bar and say why you understand there is this push to use particular teaching models for physical education? And while I'm waiting for those to pop up, models-based practice wasn't something that was pushed in my preparation for teacher education. I went through Underdale Teachers College. I had Alan Launder, who was an excellent practitioner. He pushed the P's of pedagogy, a framework to provide what we would now call quality teaching. But the whole idea of adopting a model which has a particular recipe to produce outcomes was not part of the way that physical education teaching was framed in my teacher preparation. Okay, I'm not seeing any responses there for an understanding of why models-based practice is pushed for physical education. But one of the key messages to take away is that when you read the physical education literature, models-based practice is being pushed heavily as the way forward for physical education teaching. I'll run through very quickly the reasons for that. The first reason for that is without models-based practice, we have no uniformity and consistency of teaching physical education across sites, 2 schools in the same suburb, no consistency in the delivery of those curriculum, no consistency in expectations, no consistency in assessment ideas. When you look at a person in physical education, the model of performance that's providing evidence for your assessment could be completely different between those 2 eyeballs within the same school and across school. So models-based practice enables some uniformity. It mitigates against the potential for student success to be determined by the randomness of the teacher that's allocated to them that year. You're allocated an outstanding practitioner, you're going to get outstanding student learning. You've got someone who's less interested, less motivated. Now, that's just part of the human condition. There are always going to be people who are less motivated, less interested, just do what they have to do, and that person is assigned to a class, those outcomes are not going to be as powerful as the person who is what we might call the master teacher, continuously learning, driving their practice, always concerned about being better, doing better to drive better outcomes for their students. So models-based practice can provide some form of moderation of practice within sites and across sites as well. Models-based practice also addresses the randomness of outcomes in physical education and the propensity of physical education to try and do a lot. Just recently on social media, there was a popular thread where someone in the US had put up, all we can do is give kids lots of experiences and hope they find something that they like to continue with. Now that's just rolling the dice. That's just randomness. Teaching's got to be better than that. The best teaching is deliberate. The best teaching is explicit. The empirical literature is absolutely clear that the role of the teacher in deliberate practice brings about deliberate outcomes, which means the student learning is intentionally improved as a result of that intentionality of the teacher. So models-based practice can help focus in on the subject matter, how best to teach that subject matter in order to get the best student learning outcomes. And it does that by providing what I referred to previously as the blueprint or the recipe, so that you get the right recipe, you get the right outcome. You tinker with the recipe, the outcome may not be as good. So therefore, the recipe provides the ideal practice to get the ideal outcome. So we have an alignment between our planning, our delivery, our assessment, because we understand the student outcomes that we're trying to get. So then we can start to talk about two aspects of that models-based practice. The first aspect we can talk about is a curriculum model, and they provide direction towards what to teach. Now, the sport education model is a really good example of a curriculum model. The sport education model aims towards competent, literate, and motivated sport participants. It has 3 curriculum aims. You can achieve the competency aim of the sport education model by using the pedagogical model of game sense or TGFU. So a curriculum model enables you to use pedagogical models for distinct aspects or aims of the curriculum. So in a sport education model, we have enduring teams that form, they form an identity, they persist for the season, they celebrate, they win, they cooperate, they collaborate together. Those enduring teams is an important inherent element of the sport education model. So TPSR is a really good framework to assess that affective aspect of inter and intrapersonal development that occurs within those enduring teams. So again, within the curriculum model of sport education, we can use a pedagogical model. So pedagogical models give us directions on how to teach specific content. So TGFU, game sense, tactical games, a constraints-led approach, is a model targeted at tactical and technical movement ability. It's not a model that was specifically developed for social and emotional learning. If our content was social and emotional learning, we would choose a TPSR model, a developing youth participation in sport model. There are other models developed for that specific physical education curriculum aim. Inherent in some of that is the impression that we power up the teachers by giving them the recipe, because the teachers may not be master chefs themselves. So what we see with our high-performing teachers is they do a lot of this stuff. So one thing that models-based practice enables is the graduate teacher, the novice teacher, the teacher in those first 5 years of surviving, enabled to power up or accelerate their development because they can take a model to achieve a particular outcome, and then as they become advanced practitioners, they're then able to vary the recipe like a chef can do, because they understand the nuances of the students in front of them. And so therefore the model needs to be nuanced, not the same for every student, because every student is not the same. And it's that last point, every student is not the same, and so the models need to be nuanced, is where the power of the spectrum of teaching styles come in. Unlike those other models, which will focus with the what or the how, the spectrum of teaching styles is about the what, why, and the how, because it's focused on the teacher as an intentional education designer. And as an intentional educational designer, you need to know what you're teaching. You need to know the why. So therefore, you need to know about the students in front of you. You need to know the starting points of those students. Knowing the starting points of those students and how they will need to engage with the task to achieve the educational outcomes needed for them means that there is not a singular model. There needs to be a model that can be diversified and nuanced so that we can differentiate the experience to meet the individual teacher's needs. Any teaching, or sports coaching for that matter, that has every student doing everything at the same time is explicitly suggesting that all of those students are at the exact same challenge point, which is not logical, because if we've got 24, 30 students in front of us, they're going to be on a continuum of readiness. We can think about where the average or the expected student would be, but we're going to have students who are our Yetis and not there yet, and they will need a particular approach. We're going to have those that are in the pocket of expectation, and then we're going to have those that are advanced. And we need to be providing an educational experience that will accelerate all three of those groups that I've just mentioned further along the continuum of achievement. And if we have a one-size-fits-all experience, the more advanced students are treading water for 5 weeks and not doing any learning because they can already do the stuff. The students who are not there yet for that challenge point, they're learning, I couldn't do this at the start, I can't do this at the end. So what they've learned is what they can't do rather than be powered up to learn what they can do. So the spectrum of teaching styles enables us to not only have a model that provides that nuance for differentiation, but also provides a lens into those second and third generation models to be able to understand the effect that the teaching is having on individual students' readiness for the challenge points that we're putting in place. So in summary, the spectrum of teaching styles is both a philosophy and it's a model. It's a philosophy of deliberate teaching. And Mostyn's famous quote is, teaching in all communities is it's a deliberate act to achieve something. Otherwise, what we're getting in physical education is a series of performances rather than learning. Learning means something changes. Learning means that in a lesson or two, a week or two, a month or two, something has changed. Emotionally, cognitively, socially, physical, in their motor skill development. If there is no change, there is no learning. In order to get learning, there needs to be deliberate disruption and intervention to move our students forward. So the spectrum of teaching styles provides a process from teacher-centered, maximum teacher-centeredness, because that's what's required of the learner, to maximum student-centeredness, where the teacher is simply there as a resource for the students who are driving their own learning. And we'll see what that looks like. So having framed models-based practice, why we need models-based practice as a concept, first generation models, second and third generation models, I'm now going to spend a little bit of time looking at the intricacies of the spectrum of teaching styles. And a concept inherent in the spectrum of teaching styles is what we call the anatomy of teaching. The anatomy of teaching puts the learner at the centre. So one of the big concepts that came out of my teacher preparation is pre-assessment is part of that gold standard, because without a pre-assessment of the student, you don't know what their starting point is. So you can't match a teaching style to a task to deliberately achieve an outcome that drives that student's learning forward, because you don't know what that student knows. Unless you know what they know, you can't drive the learning improvement. So pre-assessment is gold standard regardless of any subject that you teach. Otherwise, your post-assessment at the end of it is meaningless because they could already be doing that stuff that you're allocating a grade to. They might have been a B at the start, they're a B at the end, it's a great grade. No learning has occurred though. And our job is to power up student learning. So the learner is at the centre. Once we understand the learner's needs as individuals and the group collectively, we can then put expectations on the student learning. And once we have those expectations on student learning, the teacher has some pedagogical decisions to make. And it's at this point of pedagogical decisions that we engage with the spectrum of teaching styles. So the spectrum of teaching styles identifies 11 distinctive styles that we can apply to achieve particular outcomes. In planning to deliver each of those styles, there will be what we call pre-impact, the planning work that is done in preparation for the lesson. There is impact, which is what happens during the lesson. And there is what in the spectrum we call post-impact, which is the student assessment and the feedback that we provide to the students after they've experienced the teaching that the individual teacher has put in place. Within that spectrum of teaching styles from A to K, we can divide those teaching styles into reproduction. That means students are in the position of reproducing what the teacher has asked. And then there is the production cluster where the students cognitively are creating ideas. So it's about the cognition of the student. The cognition of the student is reproducing what the teacher has told them. That's a particular way of thinking, requires transmission style instruction. But then there is production where we want the students to create, to innovate, to evaluate, to analyse. That requires different types of pedagogy. However, a distinctive component of the spectrum of teaching styles is its non-versus philosophy. Now, in the early days of TGFU research, they put tactical versus technical. And so technical was problematized. Technical was somehow deficit. Tactical teaching was better. So we wanted to prove whether tactical teaching got better, different, empowered outcomes for students. So we did this versus approach to the research to prove that a tactical teaching style like TGFU was better than a technical style. But that's not the way teaching works. There's going to be a time when all teaching styles have utility to bring about a student outcome. And that's where the wisdom of the non-versus philosophy of the spectrum is really important. All teaching styles have their place in what we call quality physical education. So very briefly, in summary, as a deliberate designer of teaching episodes, there is a chain of teacher decision-making. There are decisions that the teacher makes before they go into class, and I've summarised them in the blue egg on the screen, and we call those pre-impact. And quality teachers pay attention to those 5 aspects of the planning for their pedagogy that they're going to put in front of the students. And then in the implementation of their lessons, there are 5 deliberate decisions that the teachers make, and they're summarised in that pink egg in front of you. And the masterful teacher at the end of that teaching experience has 5 deliberate decisions in what we call the post-impact. And that's largely around evaluating the efficacy of the teaching that we've just done. But part of it is also in evaluating that efficacy in order to be able to give feedback to the students, in order to drive the learning cycle, is informing whether we got our pre-impact and impact planning right, and right for who. So I want to move now to very, very briefly run through each of the styles Then I'm going to give you some time to actually go to the Spectrum of Teaching Styles website and do an exploration before we finish off, and I'll put up a game-based teaching episode and show why that teaching episode can't be considered one style of teaching, and where when we look at it through the lens of a spectrum of teaching style, we will see that there's actually 3 or 4 different styles of teaching in play, even though you might hear TGFU is guided discovery. What you'll find out later on is TGFU is not guided discovery. TGFU is actually a cluster of teaching styles. So the first set of teaching styles is the reproduction cluster, styles A to E. Command style, direct teaching style, people would be familiar with that, and that's one of them. You know, James identified teacher directed when I asked about the teaching styles people were familiar with. In a spectrum of teaching style, that is called command style A, needs a predicted response. You know, something like archery might be very suited to a command style and a practice style approach because you need to keep people safe. So you're going to have a firing line, you're going to have a safety line, you're going to have everybody firing on command. They're all going to be firing in the same direction. They're not able to step into the space to retrieve the arrows until a safety call is made. So it's a very structured, very directed, necessarily so because there is a priority to keep people safe. Practice style is possibly the most common style that we see in PE teaching and sports coaching. It's reproducing a task. Teacher will say, here's the objective, here is the practice task, here is a demonstration of a group doing the practice task so you know what it looks like. Could be a drill, could be a small-sided game, doesn't matter, it's still a practice task. And then the students go and do that task that the teacher has set. They go and practice. Reciprocal style C, some of you may have used a game performance assessment instrument in what we've called bench coaching, where the students will sit there with a quantitative tool and they will tag the number of times the students support, the students make the right decision, and the students execute that with the right technique. And they're doing that annotation, whistle blows, bench coaches go out, provide that peer feedback, or it could be a biomechanical analysis. They've got the preparation, contact, follow through phases and some biomechanical markers, and the bench coach is looking at it, and then the whistle blows and they'll go out and give some feedback to their peer. So we see a lot of reciprocal style teaching also in PE. Self-check, it's a style that I don't see a lot of in schools these days. It used to be quite common. Task cards are a typical self-check style. There might be a series of stations with a task card. The task card has the not only the instructions, but also the information on what is good enough, the quality of the performance. And so students will do a continual check-in about whether they're meeting the standards for performance that are set to the task card. So it's a self-check. Video feedback enables us to do that really effectively now in physical education, putting things on delay. Students can perform, finish their rotation, go and watch themselves on the video, see what worked, where maybe in the kinetic chain their performance needs to be more efficient and effective, and determine to go and work on that on their next performance task. Inclusion style E, differentiated strategy, giving students some choice. So, for example, in badminton, we may not start everybody with a badminton racket. We may decide that we want to bring the hitting zone closer to the hand, so we're going to have some short-handled rackets. We want to make a bigger hitting zone, so we might be using some short-stemmed tennis rackets so that the margin for error of getting the racket head in the right space is increased. And then for those more advanced students, we're going to have longer stems so the hitting distance is further from the hand, more perceptual difficulty, smaller normal badminton size heads because they're ready for it. So we'll differentiate the challenge point by providing a range of rackets with differentiated distances from the hitting zone to the hand and different hitting zones in order to make it either a little bit easier or a little bit harder depending upon where they are. That would be an example of an inclusion style in physical education. Then we've got the production styles, where we're asking the students to analyse, evaluate, create, synthesise, not just to replicate. And when we look at game-based approaches such as TGFU, game sense, constraints-led approach, which there's a lot of advocacy towards using those to power up students' learning in games and sport teaching, they're often referred to as guided discovery. Now, in the spectrum of teaching styles, guided discovery means something very specific. It means that the teacher has planned a series of questions that lead to an eventual answer. That's it. So each question sequentially builds, and they've been planned beforehand because the teacher knows the outcome that they're looking for. So picture this scenario in a phys ed setting. You've designed a game, and the game, you're looking for a particular moment in the game. You know the moment's going to occur. You don't know when it's going to occur, but you know that in this game, this moment always occurs. When it occurs, you're going to freeze the game, and you've got a series of questions prepared to guide discovery to an unknown answer by building the knowledge brick by brick, answer by answer, small steps. That's guided discovery. Guided discovery is not asking a few questions at the end of the lesson. It's not just randomly seeing something and going in with a question. It's a very planned and deliberate act towards a moment. And when that moment is recognised, we go in to do that logical and sequential thinking through a series of questions. Convergent discovery is where we're asking the students to discover a single response to something that's new and unfamiliar. So it could be just a question. Because we've seen something, we want to ask that question, and there is just the one answer. That's different from divergent discovery, where there are possibilities, where there are options, and we want to set a scenario in the class where we explore those options, evaluate those options, and then choose an option that we feel confident gives us the best outcome. So divergent discovery works really well in a problem-based teaching scenario. There's the learner-designed individual program, where we take the discovery styles from group settings into individual programs. We're now taking another level of teacher-centeredness away, and it's now the learner-initiated style J, where the learners are designing their learning program with teacher assistance. So the teacher is now a resource and the learner is driving their program. And then there is self-teaching. Self-teaching. A great example of self-teaching is, I've forgotten the name of the African athlete that won a gold medal in the javelin a few years ago at the World Championships. He was asked, we haven't had a world champion in javelin. That's not a familiar sport for an African world champion. Who's your coach? And his answer was, YouTube is my coach. I'm self-taught off of YouTube. That's an example at the extreme end of that self-teaching style. I'm reminded that I got given a guitar in grade 6. I thought it'd be really cool to learn to play the guitar. Unfortunately, guitar practice was the same night as football practice. Football practice won out. So the guitar that my grandmother gave me has been sitting there now for 40 years, waiting for me to learn it. And I'm supervising a music teacher. And I said to this music teacher, I'd love to learn the guitar. Who's someone nearby that would be really good for me to go and learn from? Her answer was YouTube. I said, you're a music teacher. You're telling me to go to YouTube. She said, absolutely, go to YouTube. You know how to regulate your learning. Self-teach using YouTube. So technology today provides the opportunity for that possibility with our top-end learners. You might think of someone who is 15, 16 years of age. They're almost Olympic world championship level in their class. Yes, Julius Yago. Thanks, Tim. Perfect. That's the Kenyan javelin world champion. You could be able to get them going on some self-teaching because they're at that stage where they can fly ahead just with a little bit of supervision. Okay. I'm hoping now Carl has popped up into the handouts the slides which has got the links to the spectrum of teaching styles. So what I'd like you to do now is to click on that link and go to the spectrum of teaching styles, because we've got this website that is a wonderful resource for physical. Oh, I'll need to copy and paste the links. Okay. Bear with me while I get the links. The first link I'm going to post.
Right.
First link I'm going to post. Carl, I might need you to post it because it doesn't want to do. Oh, there it is. Let's see if that works. So I've now posted a link to the spectrum of teaching styles, which will take you to the landmark styles, so you can read a little bit more about each of those styles. So spend a little bit of time searching through those. The second link that I'll post in a moment will take you to the Spectrum of Teaching Styles book, Teaching Physical Education. That is a free download. In each chapter on the landmark styles, it gives you really clear examples of how to use the style to achieve a particular outcome. Now, once you're at the Spectrum of Teaching Styles website, you'll be able to just click on the link to the book and download it anyway. But I'll now post the link to the book if you want to use the specific link. Now, what I would love participants to be doing, so that I know you're still out there, if something pops up and you think, wow, this is amazing, please share it in the chat. Or if you're, now that you're browsing through the Spectrum of Teaching Styles website, if you've got a question from something that you've read, please also pop that in the chat. But I'm going to have a coffee and save my voice for a minute or two to allow you now to cruise through the Spectrum of Teaching Styles website and see what a tremendous resource that is. And then I'm going to look at a couple of specific teaching episodes and how we can interpret those through a Spectrum of Teaching Styles. So hopefully I'll see a few comments in the chats while I finish my coffee. If you've been able to download the book, maybe send me, if you could, to a message saying, got the download. I'm not sure that we've got a thumbs up emoji, but a thumbs up emoji would be really cool as well. Excellent. We've got some thumbs up happening. It's not often you come to a conference and you're able to get a free book. At Flinders University, our first year pre-service teachers get this book downloaded, and this is our footings. This is our pedagogical platform for all of our pre-service physical education teachers, the Spectrum of Teaching Styles. So before we introduce the game sense approach, sport education model, TPSR, we give them this pedagogical framing, non-versus approach to the, I'll call it the complexity. It's not complicated, it's complex. Complicated means it's hard. Complex means that there's lots of parts to it. Spectrum of Teaching Styles is complex, and that's a good thing because it enables us to be nuanced for the specific needs of our individuals. Good to see a number of people getting that book downloaded. Yeah, Greg, I can. So when I'm talking about first, second and third level models, I'm talking about generation, not in levels as in where they might hierarchically sit. I refer to them as first generation models because they were developed in the 1960s. To give you an example, Hellison came out with a model called humanistic physical education before he developed TPSR. So humanistic physical education is a first generation model. TPSR becomes a second generation model. Molden and Redfern's teaching physical education is a first generation game-based approach. Alan Wade's FA Guide to Coaching is a first generation game-based coaching model. TGFU is a second generation. Game Sense approach is a second generation. Lino, no problems raising your hand. I took that to be the same thing as a thumbs up. Oh, happy face by Carl. He must be enjoying the website. All right, 30 seconds more exploring the website, and then I'll look at some specific teaching episodes. So in summary, a really big idea that I've tried to put across this morning, well, it's this morning where I am, I think it's afternoon where you are. The fundamental issue in teaching is not which teaching style is better or best, or which model is better or best. It's which teaching style is appropriate for reaching the objectives of your teaching episode. Every style has its place in the multiple realities of teaching and learning. So it's not this versus this, it's always, is it this and this style? And that's what we'll look at next. In this last 10 or so minutes that I've got, if you're interested in some follow-up reading, there are some links there to the readings that have informed this next section, so you can provide some more depth to your understanding following this session if you're interested. So when I'm looking at this, if you can now in your chat, I talk about the Game Sense approach as play with purpose, as non-linear pedagogy. If you're familiar with TGFU, I would argue TGFU is still linear pedagogy because it goes game, inquire, practice, back to the game. There's a 6-step cycle that you follow in sequence. Game, inquire, practice, back to the game. The Game Sense approach, though, is non-linear pedagogy because we play a game. We then inquire about that game. We might need to go to a practice task. Some players might need to go to a practice task, and some players might be able to go straight back to the game. Or after that inquiry, we might need to go back into the same game because we've used our questions to focus the players thinking on particular outcomes, and we want to see that thinking in action in the game. Or we've used the inquiry to set up an exploration. So we go into a game which tweaks a rule, a condition, a constraint, because we're looking for a particular way of thinking or performing that we've set up through the inquiry. Or we play, we go to the inquiry, we go into the practice because we need to build a technical ability to put into the play, because we know that it's an aspect of the game that won't just emerge simply by playing the game. It's something that in the sport that I work with, Australian football, we might call an aspect of their craft, which is something that's not necessarily intuitively picked up either by mimicry, by watching the elite players, or by experience, because it's such a fine aspect of the game that gives the metaphorically 1% performance improvement in what you're doing. So what teaching styles might be represented in this non-linear, what I call play with purpose version of the Game Sense approach? Now, given time, I won't go to the chat box. I'll unpack this for you. So the teacher has decided what the game's going to be. So because the teacher has decided what the game is going to be, that's not guided discovery. That's practice style. They're practicing. In really powerful physical education, that first game will be retrieval practice. It will be consolidation of our know, do's and understands. It will be bringing back into context all of the things that we expect the learners to be able to do and doing our quality check that they can do what we think they can do, that they know what we think they should know. That's the purpose of the first game. No difference than in a quality science class where we'll start with some form of retrieval practice to locate them back into the context of the teaching before we add the new, the unexpected, the addition to that day. If I'm asking them, if in the inquiry I'm asking them to discover something that I have determined, a particular response, it might be convergent discovery. If I'm allowing for some students to go back into the game because they're at the challenge point and the convergent discovery is enough to focus their thinking to get them to play in a particular way, they'll go back and play. But if there's aspects of the technical toolkit that will prevent that performance from occurring, I might need to isolate one or more students into a practice task. Now I'm using inclusion style because I've got differentiated practice based on the learning needs of the individual. It's not everybody doing the same thing at the same time. It could even be that I differentiate that first game by starting to go, okay, you move up to this court, you move down to that court, you move over there, so that I'm getting students grouped based on challenge point because I've used that first game diagnostically to assess where the students are at and then group those students together at their readiness level so that I can get them, I can get the pedagogy right for their particular needs. So it's often said that the game sense approach, TGFU, is guided discovery. But what I'm suggesting here is it's often convergent discovery rather than guided discovery because there isn't that 5 or 6 series of questions leading to the discovery. The other complexity when we look at a game sense approach, TGFU, which is distinguished by the use of questions in preference to direct instruction of answers, is that when we ask a group a question and one student gives the answer, unless we've given some form of pre-assessment, we don't know whether they're telling us something that they already knew or whether they've had the light bulb moment of discovery. It could be that they're just reaching into their understanding and bringing it into context. That's not discovery. That's application. And then we ask another question to extend that and we get a version of the answer. Well, everybody else has heard that answer. So it's no longer discovery for the rest of the group. It's going to be reproduction. A reproduction of that answer. It might extend it a little bit, but it's still the same answer. So it's not guided discovery then for the rest of the group once we've got that first answer out because we're still exploring the same concept. Let's look at another example. Here's one from an activity that I wrote about. It's in a hockey context. You can read the instructions there. I won't go through them, but it is important to read the learning episode. Now, as we read that learning episode, I'll highlight a couple of things. The teacher has decided what the players need to do. The teacher has explained to the students what they need to do. Okay, that's not a problem. That's quality practice. The teacher has set out exactly the dimensions of the practice task. Students attempt to solve the problem and score a goal while playing the game. So in order to understand the teaching style or styles that are in place, we need to look at pre-impact, who's making the decisions, at impact during the teaching episode, who's making the decisions, and post-impact in the assessment and the feedback, who's making the decisions. Pre-impact, the teacher has chosen the subject matter. At impact, they're instructed by the students on how to do it. In the instructions, the words discover or create were not used. So the language of the teacher is really important in setting the cognitive challenge and determining where the teaching style sits on the spectrum. In an episode like this, students are most likely told the aim of the game is to push the ball over your opponent's line or goal. So they're not discovering what to do. They're given a very specific objective to achieve. Now, they may be stopped during the game, immediately after the game, and ask questions to identify problems. And teacher is giving feedback to the answers that come from the questions. So when we look at that against the detail of the spectrum of teaching styles, this teaching episode is mostly practice style B. And yet a lot of people will look at that type of activity and say that's a small-sided game, that's game sense approach, that's guided discovery. But when we look at it very deeply through the decisions and who's making the decision and the degree of student empowerment in that decision-making, it's mostly teacher-directed, teacher-led, teacher-structured. So it's an example of getting the students to practice. Let's have a look at another one, which is a typical invasion keep-away game. And again, you can read the teaching episode there, and we're asked to think about who's making the decisions at pre-impact, impact, and post-impact. Now, a couple of things that I'll highlight in setting up this teaching episode. Identifying a problem doesn't mean discovery. Identifying a problem could be recall because the students already have an understanding of the situation, and identifying it is using existing capability. The teacher, again, has not instructed the students to discover a problem, but to identify. So therefore, it can't be discovery. It's identification. The implication is recall of understanding. Arrive at appropriate solutions as a group. Again, if we wanted the students to discover a new solution, the students would first of all need to identify all the solutions they currently know, park those aside, and so we've got to come up with something completely different because that's what we already know. And that's not part of the teaching episode. So again, on a surface level look, it's a game sense approach. Many people say, oh, it's got to be guided discovery. But when we look at it, it could be practice style B, and depending upon the instructions that are given, it could be discovery style for some students, because some students may not know the solutions. It could be novel to them. And again, that's why this notion of pre-assessment, knowing the learner. In the diagram of the spectrum that I put up earlier, the learner is at the center because it's the learner's know, do's and understands that are driving the matching of the teaching style to the task so that we can power up that student learning. So the final concept that I've attempted to get across here is that even in a model like the game sense approach, which is often defined as guided discovery, we see that it can be a cluster of teaching styles. It's not just one style of teaching. So to finish off with, we look at this model of play with purpose that I talk about. We could add in a warm-up and a warm-down, which is common in sports coaching and PE settings. Usually the teacher will instruct the warm-up, or in a sports coaching setting, particularly at the higher level, the strength and conditioning coach or the coach will lead the warm-up. That's command style. We then go into the first game, being set by the teacher or coach, that's practice style. Could have some inclusion if we've differentiated the games based on different readiness levels. We ask some questions. Generally what we'll see is convergent discovery because the teacher or coach has identified an answer that they're looking for. In the warm down, if we go into a coaching setting, and in that coaching setting we might go into our line groups, and within those line groups we have particular aspects of the craft that we're trying to develop, and we've given a task card for the students to go out to a station, and in that station during the warm down they practice that aspect of the craft they need to improve. Well, that'd be a self-check style. If, however, in that warm down it's teacher directed, it goes back to being command style. So there's a misconception that the spectrum is 11 styles of teaching. The spectrum enables us to see teaching in its complexity, which is always a cluster of teaching styles. And if we vary this very subtly, students come into our gym, they're in work groups, the captain of the work group goes and gets the task card. The task card sets out the performance criteria and the task, and the students go and set that up and do that as part of their warm-up. It's no longer command style. It's now self-check against the task. If we add in bench coaching rather than practice, because the students are going to go out and watch and observe, now it might be, instead of convergent discovery, some divergent discovery. And we've got reciprocal because we've got the bench coach coming in. So in summary, we see 11 teaching styles, very much the learner at the centre of it. We understand the expectation of student learning. We then set up the teacher for pedagogical decisions. So, thank you for joining me today and learning a little bit about the spectrum of teaching styles. Now you've got downloaded the book, you'll have the opportunity to explore it in more detail, but please contact me with any questions, any follow-up. If you've got an idea for a research project, love to hear about that as well. So Juliet and Heather Pens, thank you for the opportunity to come in and have a chat today. I'm not sure whether Carl told you I could go for an extra 15 minutes. So I'm not in trouble. I just followed Carl's direction.
Perfect. Absolutely. A massive thank you to you, Shane. Firstly, a quick apology too. I don't know where that reference to Melbourne came from, and I'm sure that anyone from South Australia would probably be appalled to think that I made that error. But your presentation was enlightening. I think that you were just, in your summing up there, you talked about those pedagogical decisions that we're making as physical educators that we do all the time as we're planning and preparing for learning, but that bringing to the forefront that the Mostyn spectrum, you're able to highlight to us that we have a really important role as intentional learning designers by using the key tenets of that spectrum. I think for Jules and I, obviously, we're kind of personifying the fact that if you've got, for example, you're looking at the decision makers and the process, and if it's the students that are empowered, then you might have that guided discovery, and we have our scout here, and then perhaps the convergent discovery where the teacher is a definitive idea of where they're taking those students, and the journey they're going on is already played out and predetermined. So it's important work for us to consider where those who is making the decisions in our learning and in the way we plan to be able to encompass not a versus, as you highlighted, but as many as appropriate of those teaching styles, with a conscious selection, I guess, according to what it is that we want to achieve. So we've got
Heather, if you got that out of today, that is awesome.
When I faced the front, and I found it, really engaging, where we're able to see that the similarities to what we do, but just understanding the importance of how that planning needs to be, considerate of that intentional learning design. So it's been fabulous, and people are coming into the chat and making mention of that, and we've had engagement for the entire hour. So on behalf of PENS, we'd like to say thank you very much for giving up your time, your energy, and sharing your expertise with us. We've really enjoyed hearing again from a second of two Australian presenters today, which is the bonus of the online conference, which we don't always get, when we're face-to-face. So we'll take that, and we're grateful for that. And we wish you all the best for the next few months and as they play out for you over in Australia.
Thanks for having me today.
Thanks.
Kia ora. Ka kite anō.